in Randolph, and I've been your Congresswoman for 8 months now, and in that time I've been very busy. You know, I went to Washington to legislate the inequities and disparities in the Massachusetts 7th, which includes all of Randolph, some of Milton, all of Everett, Chelsea, most of Cambridge, Somerville, and then 70% of the city of Boston. This is a district that is 800,000 people strong, 53% people of color, 40% foreign born, and almost 40% single female-headed households. A vibrant district, a beautiful district, a diverse district, an unequal district. And those inequities were created by policy. And those policies were created by me. And so it is my contention that those policies and these outcomes can and should be disrupted by this woman. There are many historical monikers about this 116th Congress. It is the first pro-choice majority Congress. It is the most diverse and representative Congress. It is the biggest class, rivaled only in size by the Watergate babies. I think that's an interesting sort of serendipitous moment in that class was elected at a time of great dissonance and polarization and corruption. But we are also the first class to be onboarded in the midst of a federal government shutdown. And although I went to Congress with an agenda to advocate for the ignored, left out, and left behind, to through legislation disrupt disparate outcomes, I also have to be nimble and reflexive to what is happening in real time. And so in the midst of that federal government shutdown, I learned that service workers, federally contracted third-party service workers, there was no mechanism to make them whole to ensure they receive back pay once the shutdown ends. There is already a mechanism for federal workers, and you heard a lot about them in the midst of the shutdown. And they're deserving of that, as are our custodians, our security workers, and our food service workers, who represent our hourly, low-wage, most vulnerable workers. Many of them are women, immigrants, people of color, and some of them missed 2 pay periods, and there was no mechanism to make them whole. And so I'm very proud that within my first 14 days as a member of Congress, in the midst of this federal government shutdown, the very first bill that I offered and introduced was a workers' rights bill. And again, having been a hotel worker, I know what it is to be a part of a workforce that is often invisibilized, marginalized, and where people don't celebrate and recognize your contributions. That bill, that back pay bill, is a bicameral bill, and that means that I have a Senate sponsor as well. I've been very intentional in the legislation that I've introduced to try to have as many Senate sponsors as possible, so that once we get a bill out of the House, I will have a partner who will carry the water for that legislation on the Senate side. And so this bicameral workers' rights back pay bill for service workers to receive back pay was introduced with Senator Tina Smith out of Minnesota. And I'm very proud to tell you that my first bill, authored in my first 14 days, was included in the House Appropriations package. Encouraging first step towards justice and a debt recovery for these families, but of course we need the Senate to do their job. And I usually have Mitch McConnell's phone number. I didn't bring it today. We'll be sure to share it with you so that you can give him a call and say, I sent you. And so I've introduced in 8 months 12 pieces of legislation of which I'm the lead sponsor. I have co-sponsored 300 pieces of legislation, and I have written and passed 10 amendments. So again, I went there to legislate, and we have been doing just that. So one of the pieces of legislation that I want to share with you that is also bicameral is a baby bonds bill. I spoke of the inequities and disparities in the Massachusetts 7th, And that is certainly true when it comes to the racial wealth gap, overlaid by the racial gender wealth gap. But in this moment, what I want to focus on is the wealth gap writ large. And so Senator Cory Booker and I introduced baby bonds legislation, which is a seed account, seed savings. For every baby born, the federal government would invest $1,000. And over the next 18 years, that fund would continue to be invested in. And those monies would accrue to as many as $18,000 to $27,000. Now that might not seem like much, but these seed accounts are targeted, focused on those communities and those families that are marginalized, disenfranchised, the most vulnerable, and who have had less of an opportunity to build generational wealth. And so it's targeted on those with the greatest need. Now, what can $27,000 mean? It can mean the down payment on a home in order to begin to build equity. It could go towards savings. It could go towards education. And so we've introduced that baby bonds bill against Senator Booker and I to address income inequality and the wealth gap. The other update that I want to provide with you is, and truthfully, one of the proudest moments of my public service career, not just my 8-month tenure in Congress, is that in the Oversight and Reform Committee of which I serve, and I serve on 2 committees, Financial Services and Oversight and Reform, we convened the first ever in the history of Congress and this committee, the first hearing on childhood trauma. And that is to continue the work that I began as a Boston City councilor. Trauma, childhood trauma, is pervasive, it is real, and it is growing, and it is choking at the promise of this district and our Commonwealth and our country, because it compromises a child's ability to grow into a well and whole adult and to make their best contribution. Trauma is not only experiencing and being exposed to gun violence or domestic violence, although our children are increasingly exposed to violence in all forms. But experiencing poverty is traumatic. Experiencing food insecurity is traumatic. Experiencing homelessness is traumatic. Experiencing displacement from gentrification is traumatic. Experiencing fear of deportation is traumatic. And our children are increasingly, in their emotional backpack that they're carrying across our thresholds into school every day, and in navigating their communities, burdened with these traumas. And so it was my honor to create space for these stories to be heard and for people to better understand what our children are managing every day. And then I mentioned earlier that when we lean in, when we engage, when we organize, when we mobilize, we can win. Yes, even in the face of what I consider to be legislated hate. When it comes to this administration and their policies, the cruelty is the point. And when it comes to their culture, the corruption is the point. And so we have been drinking from this fire hose of many coordinated attacks. That burden is certainly heavily borne by our immigrant and refugee friends and family and neighbors. Just recently, the Trump administration terminated the medical deferred program, which means that children that are battling cancer, cystic fibrosis, chronic terminal illnesses, and rare diseases received word that they would have 30 days to return to their native home. Children like Jonathan Ramirez, 16 years old, whose sister already died from cystic fibrosis in Honduras, has been here receiving life-saving treatment and said, "I do not want to die." And eliminating that policy is a death sentence. But working with Senator Warren and Senator Markey and 2 other of my House colleagues, we were able to shine a light on this injustice. There was public outcry, and that policy has been reinstated. And that is because we leverage the power of the Oversight and Reform Committee. We leverage the power of collaboration, and we harness the public outcry and outrage about this cruelty. And so I hope that emboldens you, that even in the face of unprecedented hurt, that when we engage and when we organize and when we are sustained in that organizing, we can win. So there have been victories like that, and then there have been victories that don't make the headlines, but are certainly no less impactful or important. Prior to my election to the City Council, I was an aide on the federal level for 16 years, 11 with United States Senator John Kerry, and 4 with former Congressman Joseph P. Kennedy II. So it's very serendipitous and full circle that I am now the Congresswoman for the very seat that I began in as an unpaid intern 20 plus years ago. When I worked for Congressman Kennedy, I started as an intern, and ultimately he hired me, and I was his Social Security liaison. So advocating for our most vulnerable veterans and seniors to intervene and adjudicate on their behalf to get benefits they have been denied. And so I know how important casework is, that we are accessible to people who have daily challenges, who reach out to our office. And so we've had legislative victories, we have had victories like the medical deferred program being reinstated, and we have had small victories like returning thousands of dollars to constituents who contact our Director of Constituent Services saying, I've been denied these benefits. And I really do think that that speaks to the power of accessible and good government. And so I go to Washington every week to fight for our shared values, but I know this work is only as good as the impact it has on this entire district. And so with that, now we're going to turn it over to questions. And I want to say also what is important to us at these meetings is not only that we are flexible and when we convene so that we can engage as many voices as possible, but that we continue to center youth voice and youth leadership and to have them lead these conversations. So can we just give it up to our young people?